Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking ahead to the Feast of Christ the King and exploring a reading which is ostensibly about a confrontation between Jesus and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, but which also draws in the temple authorities into a complex 3D game of chess. Before we get to grips with this passage, however, you may find it helpful, if you've not done so already, to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which is just below the video in the description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may find it helpful to look up, the Bible study questions for later on, and lots of space to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado then, friends, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 33 to 37. It is early in the morning of Good Friday, and Jesus has been arrested by the Jewish authorities. He was first taken to Annas, but then bound and brought to Caiaphas, who was the elected high priest at that time, as we learn in chapter 18, verses 19 to 24. After Peter had denied him for the third time and the cock had crowed as Jesus had predicted, which we see in verses 25 to 27, Jesus had been taken to the headquarters of Pontius Pilate. And as it says in verse 28, it was early in the morning. Now, as his accusers refused to enter Pilate's palace in order to avoid defilement before eating the Passover meal, as we also learn in verse 28, Pilate came out and spoke to them in an exchange in which he wanted to hand Jesus back to them, but in which they made it clear that they wished him to be subjected to the death penalty. They wanted him to be crucified, as we see in verses 29 through to 32. That's where today's infamous exchange between Jesus and Pontius Pilate takes place. And it leads, if we were to read on a little bit, to Pilate's infamous question, "What is truth?" and to the release of the bandit Barabbas instead of Jesus, who, as we learn at the beginning of chapter 19, was then flogged. So, in other words, we're looking at today a snippet of a much bigger story that John paints for us. And we have Jesus coming towards the glorification, as John's Gospel sees it, of the cross, having chosen, as we see in the first 12 verses of chapter 18, to be handed over. And this is significant because it shows us ultimately that Jesus was the one in control of events here. We've also got in this reading Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, who made a point of coming to the city of Jerusalem in order to supervise the three main pilgrimage festivals where thousands of people would come to Jerusalem and swell its population by as much as 5 or 6 times its normal number of people. And we also have, although they're not explicitly mentioned here, the temple authorities. Those were people whose power was directly threatened by the way that Jesus behaved, because he highlighted, by living and loving with the freedom of God, all those ways in which they contributed to the oppression of their own people. And we know that Caiaphas, the chief priest that year, had declared that it was better for one man to die for the sake of the nation than for Jesus to be allowed to carry on freely exercising his public ministry. Now, it's helpful to keep in mind as we read this passage and look at some of the differences we find in comparison to the Synoptic Gospels, for example, that John's was the last to be written, around 90 to 95 of the Common Era, and it includes a lot of significant theological reflection. So, for example, in Mark's Gospel, there's a kind of denial of the idea that Jesus is a king, whereas here in John, Jesus very much embraces that idea as much as he turns Pilate's understanding of what that means and looks like on its head. Now, we need to keep in mind that unlike in the UK in 2021, as just one example, where we have a constitutional monarch whose powers are limited, kings, and indeed queens in Jesus' day, were usually absolute rulers. And the succession could be determined by inheritance, passing the crown from one male relative to another, but not necessarily. And sometimes it was violent revolution that would lead to the seizing of power and the passing of it from one group to another. So there are a couple of pertinent examples of that. We've got Judas Maccabeus, who established his dynasty around 167 to 160 of the Common Era by leading a successful revolt against the occupying Syrians. That was one example of someone who hadn't had any previous claim to the throne coming to power through military prowess. And we know that closer to the birth of Jesus, Herod the Great had become a puppet ruler who was granted his authority to govern by Rome, following his defeat of the Parthians around the year 30 BCE. Pilate would have been aware of some of this turbulent history in the area of Judea that he was charged with governing, where he was charged with maintaining the Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman Empire, a peace that was maintained at the point of a sword. And there was no way that he was going to allow a new king, a rival to Caesar, to emerge on his patch. And thus it was that although Jesus didn't look like a king in ordinary terms, Pilate asked him in verse 33 if he was indeed the King of the Jews. Jesus responded, as he very often did and in typical rabbinic fashion, to this question with another question of his own. And so he asks Pilate in verse 34, did you come up with this yourself, or did somebody else tell you this? Pilate's response to Jesus, as we see in verse 35, is kind of dismissive. He kind of waves the question away, effectively saying that he couldn't be expected to understand all the ways of the Jewish people that he was charged with governing, which says a lot about how much value he placed on the lives and culture and understanding of those people. But as he says at the end of verse 35, Jesus must have done something wrong, surely, for his own nation and chief priests to have handed him over in the first place. This leads in verse 36 in its first part to Jesus admitting to having a kingdom, a statement that Pilate goes on to seize on at the beginning of verse 37. But he emphasises that it's not the kind that comes from this world, that grows up in the normal world, to borrow Bishop Tom Wright's translation. It doesn't, therefore, have a this worldly origin, as much as it very much has a this world destination. Hence Jesus talking more than once about sending his followers out into the world to proclaim, to embody God's kingdom. We see, for example, in chapter 17, verse 18, and later on, post-resurrection, in chapter 20, verse 21. And Jesus points out, as we read on in verse 36, that if his kingdom was from this world, if it was the same type of kingdom as Pontius Pilate and as the temple authorities who'd handed him over, then his disciples would have been fighting to stop him being given over in the first place. And I kind of think, therefore, that Jesus is teaching Pilate the lesson he had to teach Peter when in chapter 18, verses 10 to 11, Peter brandishes his sword and attacks one of the servants of the chief priests in a misguided attempt to defend Jesus. And where he's told Jesus needs to drink this cup of suffering. So again, it draws us back to the realization that Jesus, not Pilate, not the religious authorities who may seem like the stronger powers in this three-way game of chess, is actually directing matters. And to push this imagery further, Jesus is not some pawn in their game. Actually, if anything, he's the one moving the pieces around. And his kingdom was fundamentally different, therefore, to anything that had come before. It was fundamentally different to that of Judas Maccabeus and Herod the Great, and especially different to that of Caesar. And that's reiterated with his comment at the end of verse 36. Now, Pilate doesn't kind of seem to take in the fullness of what Jesus is saying, and instead, as he does at the beginning of verse 37, he seizes on one part of what Jesus has said and says, well, so you are a king then? To which Jesus says, well, you say I am. But effectively, he goes on in verse 37 to say, but you just don't get what that actually means here. Pilate's told that Jesus was born and came into the world to testify to the truth of the God who sent them. So when it talks about Jesus being born and coming into the world, we might think back to the prologue of John's Gospel, to chapter 1, verses 1 to 14, where we learn that in the beginning the Word was with God and was God. We might think, when we talk about testifying to the truth, of Jesus having said in chapter 14, verse 6, that he was the way, the truth, and the life. In other words, he was, and indeed is, the one who embodies God's truth in his very person as the Word made flesh. And we have an echo of chapter 10, verse 5, of his teaching about being the good shepherd and the response of those who hear his voice, who recognize the truth that he embodies. And he states that those who belong to the truth of God listen to him, just as the sheep respond to the words of the good shepherd and are not drawn away by any false shepherds. We might say in this context, false kings, false rulers, false powers, like the temple authorities, like Pontius Pilate. And if we were to read on a bit into verse 38, we'd see that Pilate responds with cynical incomprehension when he utters that famous phrase, "What is truth?" What Jesus is pointing to is a truth that's very different to anything it seems Pilate had in mind, which was truth maintained at the point of a sword. Jesus was pointing to a listening, a truth that draws out a wholehearted response. And Pilate goes on to use him as a kind of judicial example, when, as we learn in verses 38 to 40, that the crowds preferred the rebel Barabbas to the innocent Jesus. And that's why he was flogged, as we learn in the beginning of chapter 19, and then brought back before his accusers. What was meant to be going on was that a chastened, belittled, mocked Jesus was being shown to those who had accused him as someone who had been put in his place, if you will. And it might remind us of Paul talking in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 25, about having been beaten with rods 3 times by the authorities to teach him a lesson when he disturbed the peace of Rome. But again, to see it in those terms is to fundamentally mistake what's going on here. Jesus is not a pawn at the mercy of Pilate and his soldiers with their crown of thorns and purple robes, any more than he's a pawn of the religious authorities who mocked him, slapped him, spat at him, and ridiculed him. Rather, Jesus, in this three-dimensional, three-player game of chess, is the directing one, the strongest one. And so it gives us an awful lot to think about as we go into our questions. We're presented with an alternative model of authority and kingship to that which we might recognise in our wider world today. And we're presented with somebody who turns so many of our ideas upside down. I hope you find it helpful thinking about those themes as we now dive into our questions.